we can get disconnected. And I find it quite striking here how there is a big consensus about the political situation being quite bad. On the economic side, I will give you a slightly contradictory picture. The headline numbers look pretty good, but what does not look so good is corporate governance. I would argue that corporate governance and governance situation has not been so bad really since '93. I would go before Potoczny to the complete economic chaos that rolled under Crossroads. And you might remember, on the economic picture, my concern is primarily external finance, vulnerability. That's where something can happen soon, within a year. It's not the headline economic numbers that are worrisome. And you might remember that in the 1980s, we talked about Romania as under the Ceausescu family, as socialist in one family. And I fear that today we can talk about Ukraine economically as capitalism in one family. You might say that it's better to have capitalism and socialism, but of course one would need to be in a slightly wider sphere than within one family. And I'll also give you two headline numbers to remember. In 1989, according to the Soviet statistics, Ukraine had a GDP per capita that was 10% higher than Russia's. Today, Russia's GDP per capita at current exchange rate is slightly more than 3 times more than Ukraine's. 3 times more. So this is the relative decline. And what is perhaps more shocking is that Turkey today has a GDP per capita that is almost 3 times higher also than Ukraine's. So this is the cost of economic misrule. And I think that Boris Tarasuk put it quite well last night, saying that the problem with Ukraine is that it's always at the crossroads. It doesn't move on. And that's very much the problem in the economy. And I'll give you a quick review of President Yanukovych's economic policies. Not too far away. Thank you. Imagine. And you can say that Yanukovych started with reforms when he came in. He did a reform program that was very good in June 2010. I would say that 2/3 of this was in line with the reform program that I co-chaired and for the next president of Ukraine, but these were words only. Then there was an IMF program a month later, and Yanukovych got a promise of $15 billion for 2.5 years. Of this, only the 2 first tranches were paid out. And then came many reform laws, and early reform measures were tightened budget, new national bank law, gas pricing hike, and law on state procurement, value-added tax refunds improved, and all this was done in 1 month. So there was a sense that after no legislation almost for 5 years, all of a sudden the laws are actually being adopted. And this was very much the international perception. Then came a big turning point that has already been mentioned, the tax code that was adopted in November 2010 that led to mass protests all over the country. This led to a huge deterioration for small and medium-sized enterprises. The medium-sized enterprises have largely suffered from this massive increase in tax revenues last year of 35%. And essentially this is because so many previously permissible tax deductions have now been excluded. And worse, probably it's 1 million small entrepreneurs who have been forced to close down. And this does not necessarily show in the economic statistics, because they were not registered, their production was not registered before, and now it has disappeared. And a lot, in 2011, we saw one substantial positive reform, the pension reform. It's very much Yanukovych which has pushed up pension costs to 18% of GDP, which is easily the highest in the world. Now, during a few years, it's supposed to decline to 12% of GDP. But this was done in a very clumsy fashion. Then we are seeing a big privatization drive, in particular in the electricity sector and of mines. But this is privatization at very low prices to pre-selected people, primarily the Moderator, who has gained massively. And we are also seeing aggravated corporate railing that was bad before. So it's easy to argue that the private property rights have hardly ever been worse than they are now. And we are also seeing unprecedented kickbacks on big construction projects, in particular in the Euro 2012 circuit. And as already been mentioned, there are a lot of reforms that are missing. And of course, the big scandal is that Ukraine, for no purpose whatsoever, apart from corruption, subsidizes the import of Russian gas by 4.5% of GDP. This is totally outrageous. Deregulations needed, judicial reform and corruption measures, etc. But then I come to the positive numbers. GDP last year increased by 5.2%, and this doesn't look all too bad. Inflation has become lower than ever, 4.6% last year, and it might stay lower than this forecast, I guess. The budget balance does not look so good. The budget deficit was probably 5% of GDP last year, and what is more concerning is that the foreign balance, the current account deficit, rose to 5.6% of GDP last year. Normally it's said that more than 4% of GDP is not healthy, and for Ukraine this is more sensitive. And this is where we see the weak points. The international reserves are now down to $31 billion. It's still a lot of money, but you can see from this is set to fall. And of course, corruption that has been pointed out, you can see that it goes from bad to worse. The red line I have here is Poland, that is steadily improving, while Ukraine is slowly deteriorating. This is Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. And here I will go to the World Bank's the Ease of Doing Business Index. And here we see a steady deterioration. And somebody mentioned also yesterday that out of 103 countries, Ukraine comes on the 152nd place, while even Russia is on 120th place. And then we can look upon particularly what is difficult in Ukraine. There are specifically three things: to pay taxes, to deal with construction permits, and to register property. In these three classes, Ukraine is among the worst in the world. So the problem is, simply and plainly, the state doesn't function. And if you have problems, then you need international support. But Ukraine's problem, as we have heard so well here already, is that Ukraine's international economic relations are awful. Essentially, there are only three sources of finance that are available. Sorry, wrong direction. One is the International Monetary Fund. It gave no credits at all last year because Ukraine did not comply with any of its promises on what it admittedly did for pension reform, but it has persistently refused to increase the gas prices, which is now the dominant IMF demand, and rightly so, because the low gas prices are only breeding corruption. That is money in the pockets of Dmitry Peterson. And Russia demands very high gas prices and offers nothing. So this is another complication. The European Union has offered a substantial, deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, but objects to the political repression. And I don't see any possibility for Ukraine to get the free trade agreement signed in the course of this year, until there is a substantial reversal of the political course. So the discussion we just had whether the European Union should sign it or not, it's not a discussion. The European Union is not going to do so. It's needed that 27 countries ratify it, and that's not going to happen until there's a substantial change in the democracy situation. So, what are the problems? Ukraine has high external debts, both public debt, about 40% of GDP, and it has about 85% at present in total foreign debt, also in the private sector. And I think that this is the critical weakness that should be of interest to you or not interested in economic affairs otherwise. That's what public financing needs are now difficult. The Eurobond market is closed. Domestic treasury bills are possible, but they're expensive. It's essentially state banks that pay back the state. The EU is closed, as I said. The IMF will demand high increases in gas prices from 30 to 60%. And Russia demands the customs union plus gas transit system plus probably a few more things. So Russia is essentially impossible. The IMF is possible but tough. And Russian bank loans are a possibility of a minor order. So this is a very tough situation for the public finance. So, and if you take the private external financing needs, they are big, 28% of GDP. And this means that Ukraine has a big vulnerability to the euro crisis. It has dominant bank financing that can freeze at any moment. And this is expensive financing. The Russian banks expand, but hardly enough. It's the only significant source of external financing that is coming. So this shows how vulnerable Ukraine is externally, and I would guess that this leads to some problem in the short term. And this means meager economic prospects. The economic growth, you see the forecast from 2 to 3, I'm rather holding it at the lower end. The main danger, as I've emphasized, is excessive public and private debt service. By normal terms, this would not be much. But if you have as bad reputation as Ukraine has today, you are not likely to get that money easily. I see no international perspectives. Possibly the IMF could give money again if Ukraine really does a substantial gas reform. But that could be a big concession from Yanukovych. On top of that, steel prices are soft. And my conclusion is that the devaluation is highly likely this year. This doesn't hang together. It doesn't look good. This is not the situation you would like to be. Thank you.